Your faith tradition might be something you keep private, or maybe something you need to share with all the people you encounter. But sometimes, even for people who have dedicated their lives to a religious order, there can be this delicate balance of following your beliefs but not alienating others who need emergency help. Today, a conversation with a nun battling human trafficking.
It's not a religious issue, it's a human rights issue.
That's to come in this episode of Faithful. Welcome back to the Faithful Podcast. I'm your host, Tony Ganser. Thanks for joining me for another episode, and please remember to rate this podcast if you can. As I said back in the first episode, this podcast aims to talk to people about their faith or lack of faith in God. And we will in this episode, but we'll also talk about a serious non-religious issue.
So I have a question for you.
This is Sister Ann Victory.
How many slaves work for you?
Giving a TED Talk.
Yes, you heard me. How many slaves work for you?
Sister Ann is a member of the Catholic Sisters of the Humility of Mary, and she's also the Director of Education for the Collaborative to End Human Trafficking in Northeast Ohio.
You say, what? Slavery? Here? We don't have slaves in our country. What are you talking about? Slavery ended a long time ago here.
Now, she was a nurse by profession. She spent about 32 years in aspects of nursing based near Cleveland, but she never really encountered human trafficking.
It was never on our radar. We had never even heard about it until late 2006. We hadn't heard the term, so we didn't know what it was and became curious about what is that and who's doing what about it, and then just being energized, I guess I would say, and eager to be doing something. Somebody should do something. And it was really a group of members of 7 different religious communities at the time. We decided we would meet until we figured it out, what we could do.
Just for a little more context before our conversation continues, and we touch on faith, and we will touch on faith, the issue of human trafficking is immense. There's a good chance you've heard something about it because of the efforts of people like Sister Ann. And it may be hard to think about people being bought and sold and exploited in our communities, but they are. And the criminality is not isolated to any one region, not isolated to any one city. In fact, if you go to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, it has a list of the most calls it gets by city, and you can go down the list. At the top is Houston with more than 3,600 calls, followed by New York, Los Angeles. Columbus, Ohio is 8th on that list. And if you go by per capita, by calls, Columbus, Cleveland, Toledo, Cincinnati, Ohio are all in the top 20. So the call numbers are increasing because of awareness campaigns. Ohio's Governor, John Kasich, was featured in an informational video, for example.
Human trafficking is happening here in Ohio. But what exactly is it? Starkly put, it's a modern-day slave trade where boys, girls, men, and women are exploited and forced into hard labor.
And every once in a while, you might see a news report about it.
Ron, there is a human trafficking warning ahead of the upcoming NBA Finals.
Well, there is, and this new task force includes the Ohio Attorney General's office.
Victims and survivors of human trafficking and abuse are in need of so many different things that Sister Ann and her colleagues really wanted to focus on one thing that they could do well. And they thought awareness of the issue was kind of the first step in fighting it. So they would begin building this coalition of organizations and experts who could provide the diverse help that trafficking survivors would need. And then Sister Ann's group would specialize in communication.
So we could do that, even though we had nurses and social workers and educators and attorneys around the table. We're not going to do the direct service, but we know who does it. So we had the opportunity to gather those folks, and still do, to start weaving the safety net that has to happen.
So who are these faith groups that all kind of came together? Are they all Christian or across the
Well,
board?
the initial steering committee was members of 7 different women's religious communities. And since then, our collaborations go far and wide. The people that we work with run from law enforcement to the U.S. Attorney to the FBI to the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center to Belfair's Homeless and Missing Youth Program, Salvation Army, National Council of Jewish Women. Whoever can help with the issue is around our table. We have over 30 organizations working with us now as Greater Cleveland's coordinated response. So you've seen those billboards around town probably.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's been part of the work of that Greater Cleveland's coordinated response.
I think it's been since 2014 that the Pope Francis has this Santa Marta group,
Yes.
which is trying to connect religious orders and Catholic activists with the police and authorities to try to close the gap. Yes. Can you talk about how this is kind of part of, I guess, the consciousness within the Catholic community, especially now?
In fact, I got to go to Rome in 2013 to be at whatever they called their first conference, and I can't remember the exact title of it, but we initially were not invited. No women religious were invited, even the ones in Rome.
Oh, wow.
So we sort of lobbied to be observers, and we got to be more than observers. We did get to raise questions and meet the Holy Father and those kinds of things. So it was an important first step, and it then connected us with the organization of, it's a network of women and men religious communities across the world who are working on the issue. It's called Talitha Cum, and the United States did not have a network at all at that time, so we couldn't join it, and now we do. It's called U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. Right. And right now I'm serving as the president by default.
By default.
Yes. Yeah, we were just sort of a little group that got together, and we had someone taking notes, and we had someone being the treasurer on our little steering committee.
You're well qualified.
And so I got to be the president. So now we're much more formal than that. But
yeah.
So that aspect is just as taken off across the country too, and it's like holding my breath to see what's going to happen next.
Yeah, sure.
And all of us are doing different pieces of the work. In this office right here locally, we've chosen not to be labeled as religious. Mm-hmm. We want it to be broader than that. So we are not under the diocese. We're a separately incorporated nonprofit with a board, and certainly the principles that we started with continue.
Was that a choice made, just a practical choice not to be overtly religious, or do you think that would hurt the cause if it was connected more prominently to the faith? Or
I don't think well, yes, we did talk about that. And at first it was pretty practical. You could only apply for funds from certain groups. If you were labeled as Catholic, you were restricted from other funds. And so we didn't want to do that because the issue is too important. And it's not a religious issue. It's a human rights issue. So we wanted that to be out there, and we wanted the openness for others of any faith and no faith to be part of this effort. So it was conscious on our part to do that. And we know it's a really both and. It's the faith community has to respond, and they do. And we have connections with all sorts of denominations and work with them on how do we do this in your parish, in your church, in your synagogue, what's going to be helpful to your congregations to realize this and to become involved in making a difference.
With so many issues, really for such a long time, the Catholic Church has been very involved in offering asylum in some cases and sanctuary to people who need it.
Yes.
Do you feel like with human trafficking, that's the same thing? We often hear about immigration in the United States, especially, that people seek out the church as a safe place. But is that also fairly prominent for human trafficking as well?
It can be in certain parts of the country. I don't know so much that it is here. And it really depends on the person who is suffering. They may be terribly mad at God. They don't want anything to do with the church. And I understand, or any church. I understand that. And God understands it. So because of the trauma that they've been through, we have to be very careful about how we help and who helps, so that they're treated with great dignity and respect and honoring what they've been through, because it's been torture. And it's really a long-term recovery process as well. So,
does that make your job more difficult, being a member of an order that you kind of have to put a pin in that pastoral care maybe and just accept the person for where they are and offer them other help?
It's not that difficult at this point because we have very strong partners who do the work daily. I don't. I do the education piece. And they do it so well, and they do it with such integrity that I trust that they will treat them with great honor and respect. So we're trying to be at the systemic level right now, yes, we'll do any program anybody asks, we'll do it. But we've gotten into the healthcare system in this area a bit, so we're educating clinicians and making sure
on what to look for
and how to respond, how to interact with the person, whom to call. And now those systems are trying to put in place what are the protocols within their system. So they have some common guidelines that we put together with a group of nurses and social workers and made a film out of it. Never did that before. And a resource manual. And so that's out there. It's being used. And each of the 4 systems are taking it on. But we've also sent it around the country, across the state, so others have it. We want to get into the education system because we believe that teachers, students, parents all need to know how to keep children safe from this and how to prevent it. We thought we'd start with a small school system.
Yeah.
But who's interested?
Right.
Cleveland Metropolitan School District is interested. So are we going to say no? Of course not.
Yeah.
We're going to figure out how do we do that as well as get into the diocesan school system. So those 2 prongs are like next on the agenda real soon.
And so far you're balancing, I guess, a more secular approach, but also staying connected to the diocese and orders.
Certainly. Yeah, certainly. It requires, any parishes that ask for a program, we're right there. Mm-hmm. My colleagues did one yesterday at St. Ambrose, and we have a couple more scheduled. Whoever asks, we're going to try to be there.
I know you're more on the educational piece, but I do wonder if you're ever faced with questions of, you alluded earlier, people who are angry at God, or if they reject help from orders that are involved in the issue because they say, I don't want religion involved in this, or...
Well, we don't push it as religion. Mm-hmm. That, I think, can be sometimes detrimental, so that's not the push. We just like to help. And here are some places where you can get very good, qualified help. So that part isn't necessarily negating religion. It's part of the fabric of who I am, so you get what you see.
Right.
Yeah,
in your personal faith journey, I guess, being involved in this, you talk about torture, you talk about women who have been devastated. In many cases, their lives have been devastated by this. Mm-hmm. How do you take that on? And how do you process that just as an individual? And how does that inform your faith journey?
It's a huge piece. And the only way I do the work, is to stay very grounded in prayer. So the day begins with an hour at least spent in quiet prayer. And I also have colleagues with whom I pray on a regular basis as well. That's the grounding for all I do. And I think it informs the work and how we do it. The gospel is very alive. Jesus dealt with people who were tortured and cast aside, and that's where we belong. And so it does at times take some courage, but it also has resulted in many blessings. People I never would have ever thought I'd interact with are colleagues, and I didn't expect that. And so finding such goodness in them and such open-hearted, generous desire to serve the good of people. And that's what this is about. Jesus didn't reject people or only go to the Jews. In fact, he was challenged not to go farther.
Yeah.
So, and that's a piece of what it is and how I do it.
Are there any particular anecdotes or people you've come across or situations you've come across where you can describe to us kind of where that puts you, where you had to maybe take a moment in prayer or you had to seek out counsel? I know it's a very personal question, but is there any particular instance maybe that you can think of through this work that challenged you? Or
just this week, we got a call, and we don't always get the calls, but the woman had called us because she was referred by Catholic Charities of Kentucky, of Louisville, I believe. She had called a friend there saying what was going on. She lives in the Cleveland area. She, her mother, and her siblings were being trafficked, especially she and her mother, and they were going to start on the 14-year-old. And it was her mother's boyfriend that was doing this. So she was really worried, and they had just left. They had left the situation, were terrified, did not want to talk to law enforcement, didn't know whom to call to get the help that they needed. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, I need some inspiration about who can really help, because she wanted to get out of this area, desperate to get out of the area and get to somewhere safe. So the local places wouldn't be safe enough for her.
Yeah.
So one of our contacts is with the Harriet Tubman movement, and they're located out in Lake County, I believe. So that was the referral I made, and got the feedback that they had been able to follow through and get her to a safe place, make some plans for how they would get her out of this area with a safety plan and what they needed, because they left with only the clothes on their back.
Wow.
So you never know when those calls are going to come.
Right.
And we don't get a lot of those, but we do get them.
And you kind of have to pace yourself through it just to stay level-headed. And
take a deep breath and think that God will provide the answer here. I just have to trust that it will be, and if it's not the right referral, we have this whole cadre of people that we can work with now, which is a great gift. I think one of the things that we've learned as women religious is collaboration. We don't do any of this alone. We never have.
Yeah.
And so we've learned how to do that, to focus on the mission and not bring our own agenda to the table, but the agenda becomes the mission, and this is what we're about. And we don't have to have it our way. We have to respect and honor and bless the gifts of others that they bring to the table. So,
do you think your time as a nurse has helped you in these situations to kind of remain calm and process the situation as you go?
Probably so. I haven't lost any of that, and I find it daily. Just, okay, we'll slow down. We'll think about what's the right approach with this hurting person. And it's given me the opportunity to work with my colleagues in healthcare, too, and have some grounding there as well, because we need to go further with the healthcare systems, and so that's a challenge that's still out there. We just need to make sure that they really get it, and not only the Catholic healthcare systems, all of them.
With working with so many different partners in this initiative, have you ever been faced with questions of the problem of pain and the problem of suffering, or I can't think of how that would come up, but have there been times where people say, how can this happen? How is this allowed in our world today, this evil?
All the time. Yeah. People just are amazed that this is going on. And when they realize, after we tell them it's going on in your neighborhood, it's not just overseas, it is right here. And that's hard for people to understand. So we do a lot of storytelling. We tell stories of our survivor friends, sometimes not using their names because that would be disrespectful of them, but what they have been through is unbelievably painful and remains. You don't just shed that when you get out of it. People don't think about the trauma that comes with being labor trafficked, with the dignity of work being nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's a whole piece that is there as well. Just that pain is part of who we are as humans and what we do to each other as humans that is not acceptable.
Yeah.
and a challenge, I think, every day for all of us to how do we make this world a more just and peaceful and loving world. So that's the challenge every day.
And in those moments when people ask those questions or you're in those situations, do you have to be selective with how you utilize the Gospels, I guess, or how you talk about faith in those moments, that maybe your support or your pastoral care is not overtly religious? Or
it will depend on the audience or the person that I'm interacting with, and if I know that they have a basis for accepting the information in one way, I'll use it. If not, then I don't.
Yeah.
But it's just basic human rights. And people get that. And that's what Jesus was about. So it's religious in its own way, I guess, in the broadest sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about your faith and about your work and how they kind of interact and where you are now? Since 2006 you started, is that right?
2007 is when we started formally.
So that's, 11 years, 10 years, 11 years. That's not a long time. It is in some ways, but you're still kind of fresh in this, even though you're well involved.
It doesn't seem like a long time, and if I needed to look for rewards of, although that's never the promise, you might not see the end. Yeah. At least now when I go to give presentations, people have heard of this. When we started, people had no clue what we were talking about. So just the fact that people now know and are concerned and want to hear, and I think it takes some courage sometimes to learn about something that might be pretty hard. That's reward enough for me. I'm still full of energy for it and grateful to have this opportunity to serve. It feels like where I'm called right now. I know I have my community's support to do it, and the support of my colleagues locally, but also now across the nation with Talitha Kum, our chapter here, U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, right here.
So you have momentum.
Yes. Yeah. There's plenty of that right now. And I look to when I can't do this. So that's part of what I need to be helping to prepare the next generation to shoulder this. And so I'm always aware of people who have it already within them and just need to have it honored and respected and maybe given a little bit of a growth spurt to get behind it and join it. Because it's not about me. It's about, this is how I and we are called to live the gospel in this aspect of suffering people.
Well, Ann Victory, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome, Tony. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Sister Ann Victory. I'll have some links up on our website with a link in the description to faithfulpod.com. Please remember to subscribe and rate this podcast, and please spread the word. And if you have ideas for stories about how faith or a lack of faith is or has played a major role in someone's life, please do drop me a line. Maybe we'll feature it in a future show. So thanks again for your support, and please have a great day.